I had my video off. There we are.
Right, Jonathan, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to submit to us.
Sure.
It was yours.
Thank you. So, my comments today will be quite brief. The Free Speech Union appreciates the intention for this legislation, but I think there are some pitfalls that we have to have a view to that safeguards will improve. In drafting legislation, despite our aspirations, we should always be aware of unintended consequences. And I've worked in drafting a number of bills myself. I've drafted hundreds of SOPs, and the process in the select committee responses, or also in the House for SOPs, are always helpful in exposing those pitfalls. So the submission today kind of focuses on the fact that with the intention of the bill to one side, there are not the safeguards to prohibit scope creep, which could extend the legislation considerably and, in my view, easily pervert what is a laudable intention of the bill and the purpose to which it will be used. To quote an individual who is well loved at the Free Speech Union, George Orwell's most important message in 1984 was that language is of central importance to human thought. That's because of its structures and the limits that it can have for the ideas that individuals are capable of formulating and expressing. And so he argued that if a government agency was to control language, such an agency could easily alter the very structure of language and make it impossible to even conceive of disobedient or rebellious thoughts because there were no words with which to think them. And of course, that is fiction. It is considerably exaggerated. It's not what this bill is about. But importantly, the point remains. I find it only too easy to believe that a mandate to control the plainness or accessibility of language can very simply be construed, in part at least, as a mandate to limit the use of some words or some concepts in the name of preserving accessibility. And that aim of preserving accessibility, again, is a laudable one. It's one actually that enhances free speech, which is the foundational rights that citizens employ in the democratic process. But the way that it extends beyond that is very important. So on the face of it, this is straightforward and benign. But should plain language and ease of understanding take into account the way communications are received by different communities? I think the point of this legislation is that it should, and there isn't guidance around the way it should be taken into account. It seems only too clear that the bill is perfectly sensible as it is written, so much so that it defies reason in many ways that the agencies and ministries this legislation would relate to or not already writing in such a way as to engage the public appropriately. Earlier, Honourable Woodhouse noted that the audience really matters, and I'm not sure that this bill takes that into account. It seems like this is part of the job already for public servants. There is already a lot of training within ministries for plain writing, so it doesn't seem this legislation is actually going to cause anything to happen that is not already happening, apart from a very important point, which is the creation of the role of plain language officers. And the very name itself seems rather ominous. And returning to the key point of what we're submitting here, there are no safeguards to really outline the direct purpose of the plain language officers or to prevent it from being extended further. And in my mind, and I think in the mind of many everyday New Zealanders, the idea that a bureaucrat will be standing over the shoulder of public service policy advisors or communications managers or content drafters, reviewing the accessibility of all material, it places considerable power in the hands of these officers. And there is exceedingly little guidance for how these officers will perform their roles. Government departments must preserve the right for policy advisors and those dealing with complex issues to speak frankly and boldly. And of course, they should do it in a way that the public can understand, sure. But the best advice is usually the simplest advice. The best drafting is usually the most simple drafting. And so this is something that is already employed for the most part. I fail to see why we need legislation to mandate it. But once control of the language is on the table, it provides an enormous stick, really, to beat those who will seek to use language that others perhaps find uncomfortable or perhaps even offensive. It gives a lever of control, not just for speech, but more importantly, the ideas that the speech represents. And again, it seems little consideration has been given to the way that this could be abused. It's not only within government departments, but externally as well. There is considerable potential that the role of the plain language officer in dealing with the public and having to respond to complaints from the public will be held accountable to complaints that could be motivated from mob advocacy. It is particularly clear that community could motivate and mobilize to coordinate claims about the communication and claims that it is not accessible for whatever perspective. And if the plain language officer is to do anything in their role, they will have to respond and account for the way that that language is then addressed to those particular communities. So a series of safeguards is needed to be included in this legislation, I think, to ensure that this remains simply to ensuring that the broad public is able to receive this information, but that it in no way could be extended to control the language that is used. The control of language is a very obviously manipulative but very perverse thing. So the Free Speech Union is very happy to offer our legal services and our experience in parliamentary drafting to work with either the committee itself or individual members on the committee to draft either SOPs or components of the report back to the House, just to ensure that account is taken for the way that this legislation could be manipulated.
Thank you, Jonathan. I've got a couple of questions. Michael, if you'd like to go
Nice
first.
to see you, Jonathan. Thank you. I'll put my question in as plain a language as I can. Does the Free Speech Union support or oppose this bill passing into law?
At the moment, we would oppose it in its current form. There is a strong case to be made, and I hope that the sponsor of this bill appreciates that caveat. There is a strong case to be made from a free speech argument for legislation like this, and it does enhance democratic participation and the right of all Kiwis to receive the information of the government's action. But in the current form, it actually presents the potential for it to be strongly abused against Kiwi speech rights and the free exchange of information in the government. So
my second and last question then is, if the form of the bill was changed, you would not have opposition to a law that frames the way speech should be written? I'm resisting the use of the term compelled speech because I don't think we're going there, but it does set it does require a certain language to be used. Now, there's so many submitters are saying, we support the intent, we just don't support the method. But what you're saying is you're quite relaxed about a law telling people how they should write stuff.
I think the argument for, because this isn't about this isn't about all Kiwis, this is about government departments. And I think Kiwi citizens have a right for their government and government departments to write in a way that is accessible to them. And so that sort of, and again, we won't use the term compelled speech, but those sort of mandates are appropriate, I think. However, at the moment, as I said, it stands to be more likely used as a big stick, and that is not appropriate.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Nosy.
And thank you, Jonathan. Just that big stick, I'll just continue on with that part. Do you have any examples or anything that you would be worried about in terms of I think our choices of words will always be regrettable, but over policing, for instance, complicated writing. What would be like, so we've been hearing many examples of how it is too complicated and that, writing in jargon and professional speech is so, have hindered people from engaging with the public services. Is there any examples the other way around?
I won't insult the intelligence of the committee. We're all very aware of enormous debates that are defining our public conversations at the moment in many ways around some very central issues. And obvious examples, perhaps crudely obvious, are those related to perhaps gender and sexuality or with regards to race. And so my concern is that while this would relate to the requirements in an annual review, whatever it is, to use simple language, on the other side, the public can then use these requirements to try and manipulate the ideas that are being communicated. And so is it possible that particular communities that are very invested at the moment in controlling the use of certain language could then say, we do not find the use of these terms, the communication of these ideas with this particular language, as respectful, and because it's not respectful, it's not accessible to us. We get distracted by the fact that we think it is dismissive of our particular you fill in the blank. And in that way, this law would then actually require them to take account for the ideas that have been communicated, not just the language. And there's no recognition of that in the legislation as it currently stands. So that could easily be dealt with, but just at the moment, it seems like there's no credence given to the fact that there are active mobs at the moment seeking to control the language of Kiwis, this will be a lever for them.
Can I just, yeah, so you're talking about
Quick one,
safeguarding. Where would you say we could safeguard? Because I'm having trouble finding kind of the clauses that you think people could construe in terms of, you know, your so-called control.
At the moment, the plain language officer will be required to respond to complaints of inaccessible language. So if a motivated activist community says that the use of certain language is inaccessible to them, now there's no criteria for that. So that if they say it is inaccessible to them because of the communication of certain ideas, which has been done within certain language, then it will abuse the role that has been currently mandated. And if the plain language officer is to do anything, they will have to respond and address this within the communication that is being complained about. It seems rather straightforward, and perhaps willfully ignorant for the drafters to not consider that there is a potential abuse here. I don't understand why there would be hesitation to saying the purpose of this does not extend in any way to regards to substance of the communication. It extends only to the form. Once that is included.
Surely I would just put to you that, just to sup on that someone could make a complaint or a suggestion to a plain language officer, but that officer would still then be obliged to operate within the guidelines set by the Public Service Commissioner, which is outlined in the bill, and would still be there to use their judgment and professional expertise to make a decision on whether that complaint or suggestion was valid or not.
Well, yes, that would be true, but there are complaints before the Ombudsman and the Public Service Commissioner around the control of language in the Public Service Commission. That's my very point. So if we follow that through, we then have a non-legislative body defining these guidelines, which are defining them in political means, where at the moment around issues of sexuality and gender, the Public Service Commission is currently considering bullying and advice around the fact that they are controlling language in that space. So I think you highlight my point very well, that a complaint to a plain language officer would then go before the Public Service Commission, and the Public Service Commission is embroiled in this in itself, which is why this legislation does stand to give a stick to activist mobs.
The question I'd put to you, the point I'd put to you just quickly, is that this is about requirements for the public service, not individual members of the public. And so the public service has quite a different role to individual members of the public. There's no requirement placed through this bill on individual members of the public.
Of course not.
Public service as a body, which is not actually an individual person. And I would wonder whether you could state that the public service has a right to free speech because they're not actually an individual person as defined by
I think that's a very interesting angle to then take this on, to at the end of this say, well, actually the public service doesn't have a right to free speech. Without the right for the public service to provide free and frank advice to the government and to other ministries and agencies, we will see a shutdown of the
bill doesn't cover advice to ministers.
This
bill doesn't, the scope of this bill doesn't cover advice to ministers, just to be really clear.
I'm going to have to wind you up now, Jonathan, but thank you for a very interesting and enthusiastic submission.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.